I never planned to talk about what happened in 1964. Most of us who were there agreed it would be better to let the night stay buried, because some things do not improve when you put words to them. They only spread. But people keep asking why we stopped hunting that area, why the trails went cold, and why men who had walked those woods their entire lives suddenly refused to return after dark. You need to understand something before I go any further. We were not boys playing games, and we were not chasing stories. We were experienced hunters, men who knew the difference between fear and instinct, between a sound made by an animal and a sound meant to draw you closer. What happened that night did not feel like panic. It felt like recognition, like something ancient had finally decided we were close enough. At first, we told ourselves it was a wolf. That was the easiest lie to hold on to. Wolves exist. Wolves make sense. Wolves stay low to the ground and move the way animals are supposed to move. What followed us through those trees did none of that. It waited. It watched. And when it stepped into the moonlight, it stood the way a man stands when he knows he has already won. I am telling you this now because people deserve to know why we swore we were attacked by a werewolf, even when no one believed us. Not the police, not the town, not the men who read our statements and quietly sealed them away. If you stay with me, I will tell you exactly what we saw, what we heard breathing just beyond the tree line, and why only some of us walked out of that forest before morning. Before we go any further, do not listen to this like a story. Listen to it like a warning. If you believe you have ever heard something in the woods that did not sound right, if you have ever felt watched during a full moon, then you already understand more than you think. Subscribe now and leave a comment telling me what you think was out there, because what we encountered did not stop hunting when we left. It only learned how to wait. The night it happened began like dozens of others before it, quiet in a way that felt earned rather than empty, because the forest in that part of the county always settled itself slowly, as if deciding whether to tolerate you. We had been hunting those woods for years, long before anyone thought to mark the trails properly or post warnings about what could or could not be found beyond the tree line. The air carried the kind of cold that sinks into your lungs and makes every breath feel deliberate. And the moon hung low and bright enough that we barely needed our lanterns to see where we were stepping. There were 4 of us that night, and every man there knew the rules without having to say them out loud. We moved quietly, we stayed close enough to see one another, and we paid attention to the small changes that told you when the woods were listening back. The first thing that felt wrong was not a sound but an absence of one, because the insects stopped all at once. And the birds that usually stirred when we passed through the underbrush went silent, as if something heavier had entered the area. We stopped walking without speaking, because fear was not what held us still, but instinct, the kind that tells you when to keep your voice inside your chest. That was when we heard the movement behind us, slow and measured, not the frantic crash of an animal startled by human presence, but the careful placement of weight, as if whatever followed us understood the importance of remaining unseen. We told ourselves it was a wolf, because wolves live there, and because giving a name to something unfamiliar is how men keep control of their hands when they start to shake. The tracks we found a few minutes later should have confirmed that story, but instead, they complicated it. The impressions in the soft earth were deep and wide, far larger than anything we had seen before, and spaced in a way that suggested long strides rather than quick steps. What unsettled us most was not their size, but their pattern, because the tracks began like those of an animal and ended like those of something that had shifted its balance and risen higher off the ground. We argued in low voices about turning back, but pride has a way of disguising itself as reason when men do not want to admit they are afraid, and we kept moving forward even as the forest closed in tighter around us. That was when the smell reached us, sharp and wet and wrong, like iron left too long in the rain. And every man there knew without saying it that blood was close, even though none of us were bleeding. The howl came from deeper in the trees, long and controlled, and it did not echo the way a wolf's call should have, because it held steady, as if whoever made it wanted us to understand exactly where they were standing. My chest tightened when I realized the sound came from higher up than it should have, because no wolf howls from that height, and no animal announces itself with that kind of confidence. We never saw it fully that night, not then. But we saw enough to know we were no longer alone in a way that made sense. and when the trees ahead of us shifted and something stepped back just out of the moonlight, I understood that whatever followed us was not reacting to our presence. It had been waiting for us. We tried to leave as calmly as we had entered, because panic is loud and the woods punish noise. But the moment we turned back toward the trail we had come from, the forest seemed to rearrange itself around us. Paths that had been familiar minutes earlier no longer lined up the way they should have, and the shadows between the trees grew thicker, swallowing the moonlight until it felt like we were walking through pockets of darkness that pressed in on our shoulders. That was when we heard it breathing, slow and deep, close enough that I could feel the vibration of it in my chest rather than my ears. It did not rush us, and it did not circle the way a predator might, because it stayed behind us at a steady distance, matching our pace with a patience that felt intentional. Every few steps, a branch would crack under its weight, and each time it happened the sound came from higher off the ground than before, as if whatever followed us was adjusting its posture to see over the undergrowth. One of the men whispered that he could hear footsteps, not paws, and I remember the way that sentence landed among us, heavy and final, because no one argued with him. We had all heard it too, the uneven rhythm of something walking upright, careful not to rush, confident that it did not need to. When we finally stopped and turned as one, the lantern light caught the edge of a shape just beyond the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, with limbs that hung too long and a head that tilted slightly as if studying us. I will not tell you it charged, because it did not, and that was somehow worse. It stood there, breathing slowly, watching us the way a man watches livestock, and when it took a single step forward into the light, I saw enough to know that calling it a wolf was no longer an option we could afford. The legs bent the wrong way before straightening, and the chest rose and fell like a human's, and when it opened its mouth, the sound that came out was not a howl, but something closer to a voice held back at the last second. We fired our rifles then, not to kill, but to create space, and the shots tore through the trees and lit the forest up in violent flashes. The creature recoiled only slightly, more surprised than hurt, and when it moved again it did so with a speed that erased the distance between us in a way I still struggle to explain. One moment it was at the edge of the clearing, and the next it was close enough that I could see the texture of its skin beneath the hair, stretched tight, as if it did not quite fit what it was covering. We ran after that, not in formation, not with pride, but with the kind of desperation that strips men down to instinct, and I remember falling more than once, scraping my hands raw on the frozen ground as something moved alongside us just out of sight. It did not chase us the way an animal would, because it stayed parallel, close enough to remind us it could end it whenever it chose to. When we finally broke through the tree line and reached the road, the forest went silent again, and the presence behind us faded as suddenly as it had appeared. We did not stop running until the lights of town came into view, and even then, none of us spoke, because we all knew the same truth. We had not escaped because we were faster or smarter. We had been allowed to leave. We did not speak about what happened that night for several days, not because we had agreed to keep it quiet, but because none of us could find the right place to begin. Every time I tried to shape the memory into words, it slipped away from me, as if the forest itself was resisting being described. When we finally sat down together to compare what we had seen, the differences between our accounts were small but disturbing, because each man remembered the creature standing slightly differently, as if it had adjusted itself depending on who was looking at it. One man swore the face was more human than animal, with eyes set forward rather than to the sides, watching us with an intelligence that felt deliberate rather than instinctive. Another insisted the legs bent wrong only when it moved, and that when it stood still it looked almost normal, like a hunter wrapped in shadow and fur. What frightened us most was that none of these descriptions contradicted one another, and together they formed something that felt less like a mistake of nature and more like a thing that had learned how to appear acceptable just long enough to be recognized. The marks on our bodies appeared the next morning, shallow scratches along our arms and backs that none of us remembered receiving, as if the creature had touched us without needing to tear us open. My hands shook when I washed the dried blood from my skin, because the cuts were clean and evenly spaced, nothing like the ragged wounds an animal would leave behind. They looked deliberate, measured, almost careful, and that realization made it difficult to convince myself that the thing in the forest had acted out of hunger alone. When the sheriff finally took our statements, his expression remained calm, in the way men learn when they intend to dismiss something without appearing cruel. He wrote everything down exactly as we said it, including the part where we told him we believed it was a werewolf. And then he asked the same questions over and over, hoping repetition would turn our answers into something smaller and easier to manage. When he suggested it might have been a bear standing on its hind legs, no one laughed, because bears do not wait, and they do not follow at a measured pace, and they do not stop chasing when the road comes into view. The investigation did not last long, at least not officially, but the woods did not return to normal. Hunters began reporting missing game, not killed, not eaten, just gone, as if something had decided to thin the forest without leaving evidence behind. Traps were found sprung and reset, and more than once, footprints appeared along the edge of the tree line that began on 4 limbs and ended on 2. People stopped going out alone after sunset, and no one admitted it was because of fear, even though fear had settled into the town like a second winter. What I could not explain was the sense of being watched that followed me long after we stopped hunting, because it did not feel confined to the woods. There were nights when I woke suddenly, certain that something stood just beyond the reach of the porch light, listening to the rhythm of my breathing the way it had in the forest. I told myself it was imagination, the mind searching for patterns where none existed, but the certainty never fully left me. Whatever we encountered had not been finished with us, and I suspected it never would be. The next full moon arrived sooner than any of us were prepared for, and despite everything we had sworn not to do, we found ourselves drawn back toward the edge of the forest as if proximity alone could provide answers. We did not bring rifles that night, because none of us believed they had made a difference before, and because something in me understood that weapons only mattered when the rules were shared. Whatever lived in those woods did not operate by rules we recognized. We kept our distance, staying close to the road where the trees thinned and the moonlight reached the ground in wide silver bands. The forest felt different than it had before, not louder or more threatening, but alert, as if it were holding its breath. When the sound finally came, it was not a howl, and it was not a voice, but something in between, a low vibration that traveled through the ground and settled into my bones until I could feel it behind my eyes. That was when I saw movement along the ridge, slow and deliberate, the silhouette of a tall figure pacing just beyond the tree line. It did not hide from us, and it did not approach, because it did not need to. It stood there under the moon, fully upright now, and I realized with a sick certainty that it wanted to be seen. The shape of it resolved gradually, broad shoulders, a narrow waist, limbs that suggested strength rather than speed, and a head that turned toward us with unmistakable focus. One of the men whispered a prayer, not because he believed it would help, but because it was the only language he had left for what he was seeing. The creature took a step forward, then another, stopping just short of the light, and in that moment I understood that it was choosing how close to come. It was measuring us, not as prey, but as something else, something that needed to be assessed before a decision could be made. When it finally opened its mouth, the sound that came out was wrong in a way that made my stomach twist, because it carried the shape of words without forming any. It was as if it were practicing, testing the limits of what it could imitate, and the realization that it might be learning from us made my skin crawl. We did not wait for it to finish, and we did not look back when we retreated toward the road, because some instincts are older than pride. The creature did not follow us that night, but I know it watched until we were gone, and I know it understood that fear alone would keep us away from its territory. That was the last time I stood that close to the forest under a full moon, and it was the night I accepted something I had resisted since the beginning. We were not dealing with an animal, and we were not dealing with a myth. We were dealing with something that knew exactly what it was and exactly what it wanted us to believe. After that second encounter, I tried to return to ordinary life the way a man returns to work after a funeral, by keeping my hands busy and my thoughts contained. But the town had changed in ways that did not announce themselves out loud. Conversations ended when someone new walked into the room, and people who used to laugh easily began watching the windows. When the moon rose, the forest was still there, and the road still led past it. But everyone behaved as if the edge of the trees had become a border between what could be explained and what could not. The first real proof that it had not stayed in the woods came in the form of a dog, a big farm mutt that belonged to a family just outside town. The animal had always been loud and territorial, the kind of dog that barked at wind and shadow, and yet one night it went silent so abruptly that the family noticed the absence of noise before they noticed anything else. In the morning, they found the dog alive but broken, trembling in the dirt behind the barn, its eyes wide and unfocused as if it had seen something it could not place inside a normal world. It had shallow cuts along its flank, neat and evenly spaced, and there were prints in the mud nearby that looked wrong in the same way the tracks in the forest had looked wrong. I went out there with two of the other hunters because we could not pretend we did not recognize those signs, and because a part of us believed that if we could understand the pattern, we could predict the next move. The mud behind the barn showed deep impressions that began like an animal's and ended like something that had stood up. And when I followed them to the fence line, I found a place where the wire had been pulled apart cleanly, as if strong hands had simply widened the gap without tearing the metal. The dog had not been attacked to be killed, and it had not been attacked to be eaten, because nothing about the scene suggested hunger. It felt like a message. That same afternoon, a boy from town came to the sheriff's office with a story he could barely tell, because he kept pausing to swallow as if the words were too large for his throat. He said he had been cutting across a field on his way home, and he had seen a tall figure near the drainage ditch, moving slowly along the reeds. He thought it was a man at first, until it turned and he saw the shape of its head, and then he ran without looking back. He said he heard it behind him, not sprinting, not scrambling, but walking with long steps that stayed at the same distance no matter how fast he tried to go. The sheriff listened, and he nodded, and he told the boy it was likely a stray dog or a bear, because that was what men in authority do when they are terrified, and then he dismissed him. I watched the boy leave, and I realized that what we had encountered was no longer content with being a rumor among hunters. It was becoming a shadow that could step closer to town whenever it wanted, and the fact that it did not rush suggested that it enjoyed the slow tightening of fear. That night, I sat on my porch with the light on and my rifle across my lap, not because I believed it would protect me, but because the weight of it made me feel less helpless. I listened to the distance, to the quiet that felt too deliberate, and I tried to convince myself that vigilance was the same as safety. Then, close to midnight, I heard something at the edge of the yard, a soft scrape against the fence, followed by a long, slow exhale that did not sound like any animal I had ever known. I did not move at first, because every instinct warned me that motion would be noticed. I simply watched the darkness beyond the porch light, and in that dim boundary I saw a shape shift, tall and upright, as if it had been standing there already and only now decided to let me recognize it. The creature did not step forward, and it did not retreat, because it did not need to. It held its position, silent and patient, and I understood that it was not testing whether it could reach me. It was showing me that it already had. The next morning, I went to the other men with a certainty that sat heavy behind my ribs because I knew the creature had crossed another line. It was not simply haunting the woods anymore, and it was not content with letting chance determine who felt its presence. It had come to my home, and it had stood just far enough from the light to remain deniable, which meant it understood something about how humans talk themselves out of truth. It wanted me to doubt my own eyes, because doubt is the first step toward obedience. We met in a shed behind one man's house, where the smell of oil and old wood made it feel like the outside world could be shut out if we closed the doors tightly enough. We spoke quietly even though no one else was near, because the habit of silence had lodged itself inside us since that first night. When I told them what I had seen, none of them mocked me, and none of them looked surprised, because each of them had their own version of the same confession. One man said he had been driving home late and had seen something standing at the edge of the road, tall and still, watching the headlights pass as if light meant nothing to it. Another said he woke to the sound of scratching at his window, not frantic and not desperate, but slow and deliberate, as if someone wanted him to know they could get in whenever they chose. A third man admitted that he had heard his name called from the direction of the trees behind his house, and the voice had sounded close enough to be familiar, but wrong in the shape of its breath. That last detail shifted something in me, because the idea of it learning voices felt worse than the idea of it learning routes or habits. Predators learn patterns, but this sounded like imitation, like practice, like a creature exploring the boundaries between human and animal, as if it could cross back and forth when it pleased. I remembered the sound we heard at the tree line on the full moon, the way it carried the shape of words without forming them, and suddenly the memory fit into place. It was not simply making noise, it was rehearsing. We decided to go back into the forest in daylight, not because daylight made it safe, but because we needed to see the ground clearly, and we needed to know whether the thing had a den, a trail, or signs that it could be tracked like an animal. We chose a route near where we had first found the strange prints, and we moved together, slow and watchful, checking the dirt and the broken brush for anything that could be read like evidence rather than fear. The forest felt less oppressive during the day, but it felt more dishonest, because sunlight did not remove the sense of being watched. It simply made the watching easier to deny. We found tracks within an hour, deep impressions in a muddy patch near a creek, and the marks were fresh enough that the edges had not yet crumbled. They began as 4 and ended as 2, and the stride between them was long enough that my stomach tightened when I tried to picture the height required to make such steps. Near the creek, we found hair caught on a snagged branch, coarse and dark, thicker than deer hair, and carrying a faint smell that made my nose sting. We bagged it in an old cloth, the way men do when they want to feel like the world is still governed by procedures. Then we found something that turned my blood cold because it did not belong in any natural explanation, and it could not be dismissed as a trick of light or an error of judgment. It was a deer carcass, not eaten and not scattered, but laid out with an unsettling care, as if it had been arranged to be found. The throat had been opened cleanly, and the rib cage had been split as if by hands rather than teeth. The strangest part was that the head faced the trail, angled toward us, as if it had been placed that way intentionally. For several seconds, none of us spoke, because we all felt the same thought forming, sharp and uninvited. This was not feeding, this was communication. When we finally turned to leave, the forest behind us made a single sound, one heavy step in the brush, and then another, slow and measured, following at a distance that made it clear it had been there the entire time. We did not run, because running would have been an admission of panic, and because daylight or not, I understood that it could close the distance whenever it wanted. We walked out together, backs tight, senses screaming, and in that quiet march I realized the truth we had been avoiding. The werewolf was not a story we had survived. It was a presence that had decided to include us. The first time it truly attacked, it did not happen in the deep woods, where a man could tell himself that nature was in charge. And it did not happen under the full moon when people expect strange behavior from animals and strangers alike. It happened close enough to town that the fear could no longer be filed away as hunters talk, and it happened fast enough that no one had time to invent a comforting explanation. A logger named Harold was found near the service road that cut along the tree line, and the sight of him made even the toughest men in town go quiet, because his wounds told a story that teeth alone could not write. I arrived after the sheriff because someone had come pounding on my door before dawn, and I knew from the tone of their voice that this was not rumor. Harold lay on his back in a patch of flattened grass, his clothes torn in strips, and the skin across his chest carried long, parallel gouges that looked as if they had been measured rather than raked. His throat was intact, which made no sense if this had been a predator, and his pockets had been turned out as if someone had searched him. The strangest part was that his face held no expression of surprise, only a tight, strained focus, like a man who had seen what was coming and had still been powerless to stop it. The sheriff's men spoke about a bear because they needed something they could name, but I could see the way their eyes kept returning to the tree line, as if they did not believe their own words. I walked the perimeter while they argued, and I found tracks in the soft dirt near the ditch. The impressions were deep and wide, and the spacing between them suggested a stride that belonged to something taller than any man in town. The pattern began with 4 points of contact and ended with 2, and when I followed the line of prints, I found a place where the brush had been pushed aside with a force that looked effortless. Harold was still alive when we lifted him, and he tried to speak while blood bubbled at the corner of his mouth. The sheriff leaned close and asked him who had done it, and I watched Harold's eyes fix on something beyond the shoulder of the man questioning him. His lips moved slowly, and his voice came out ragged, but the words were clear enough to freeze my hands where they rested on the stretcher. He swore it had been a werewolf, and he said it the way a man speaks under oath, not begging to be believed, but refusing to lie even when he knew disbelief was waiting for him. That statement changed the town, because once a man says something like that with his body broken and his fear stripped bare, it becomes harder to laugh it away. The sheriff tried to keep it quiet, but the story moved through kitchens and bars faster than any official denial. People began locking doors earlier, and mothers stopped letting children run errands at dusk. Men who had never prayed found themselves whispering into the dark, not because they believed in mercy, but because they wanted to feel less alone. That afternoon, the three of us who had seen the creature agreed to do something we had avoided since the beginning. We agreed to set a trap, not like the ones used for animals, but a trap that relied on understanding its behavior, because this thing had shown intelligence, patience, and interest in human routines. We chose a stretch of road where the trees pressed close and visibility dropped quickly, and we stationed ourselves with lanterns low and rifles ready, because if it returned, we needed proof that could not be dismissed as hysteria. The night settled in thick and cold, and the air smelled of wet earth and pine. Hours passed with only wind and distant owls, and for a moment I felt foolish, as if we had invented our own nightmare and then built a stage for it. Then the forest went silent in that sudden way it had before, and the hair along my arms lifted as if the air itself had shifted. I heard breathing first, deep and slow, coming from just beyond the trees, and the sound carried a calm certainty that made my stomach tighten. A shape moved at the edge of the light, tall and upright, and it paused as if measuring our line of sight. It did not lunge, and it did not snarl, because it had no need to perform for us. It stepped forward once, letting the lantern glow catch the contour of its shoulders and the outline of its head, and I realized it was not here to be trapped. It was here to see how far we would go. Then it did something that made my blood run cold, because it leaned slightly forward as if tasting the air, and in a voice that sounded almost like a man's, it let out a single broken syllable that resembled my name. The sound was imperfect, rough around the edges, but it was close enough to prove that it had been listening to us for longer than we wanted to admit. When it attempted my name, something inside me shifted from fear into something sharper, because fear can make you hesitate, but certainty makes you act. I raised my rifle, and the other men did the same, and the lantern light trembled as our hands tightened around metal and wood. The creature remained at the edge of the clearing, still upright, still calm, watching us the way it always had, as if it understood that our weapons were only symbols of control and not true threats. I fired first, and the sound cracked through the night like a judge's gavel, because I needed the moment to become real. The bullet struck a tree trunk close enough to shred bark, but the creature did not flinch the way an animal would. Instead, it shifted its weight with a controlled ease, stepping sideways as if it had expected the shot and planned for it. The second man fired, then the third, and the flashes lit the forest in brief, violent frames. But each time the creature moved, it did so with smooth precision, never panicked, never hurried, as if it knew exactly where the limits of our aim would be. Then it advanced, not sprinting, not charging, but walking forward with long, measured steps that reduced the distance like a clock counting down. I felt the urge to run rise in my chest, but I forced my feet to hold, because I understood that if we broke now, it would learn what it wanted to know. It would learn that men fold under pressure, and it would learn that it could shape us with fear the way a hunter shapes an animal with a leash. The creature stepped into the lantern light, and for the first time I saw enough detail that the memory still visits me at night. Its body carried the mass of a powerful animal, but its posture carried the certainty of a man. The arms hung long and heavy, and the hands were not paws in the way a wolf's paws are, because the shape suggested grip and intention. The head was unmistakably wolf-like, but the eyes were forward and focused, reflecting the lantern glow with a steady awareness that felt personal. This was not hunger looking at us. This was judgment. It stopped a few yards away, close enough that I could hear its breath and smell the faint iron scent that clung to it. The sound coming from its throat was not a snarl, because it carried restraint, as if it were holding back something it could release at any time. I tried to speak, not because I believed conversation could save us, but because a part of me wanted to test the boundary between myth and reality. My voice came out strained, and I demanded it stay back, and even as I said it, I knew how meaningless the words were. The werewolf tilted its head slightly, the way it had before, as if listening for tone rather than content. Then it made a noise that sent cold through my ribs, because it was not fully a howl and not fully a voice, but a low sound that shaped itself around human cadence. It was imitation again, practice again, and for a moment I had the sick sense that it was enjoying the effort, the way a clever child enjoys repeating a forbidden word. One of the men behind me stumbled, either from fear or from the uneven ground, and in that instant the creature moved. It crossed the space with a speed that did not match its calm posture, and it struck the man with a force that threw him backward like a rag doll. The attack was efficient, not messy, and it lasted only seconds because the creature did not linger to tear or feed. It left deep marks across the man's shoulder and chest, and then it stepped back into the lantern light as if returning to its original position, as if it wanted us to witness the result and understand it as a statement. I fired again, closer this time, and I saw the bullet tear through hair and skin along its side. The creature finally reacted, but not with pain the way an animal would. It jerked its head toward me with sudden focus, and I felt something like recognition pass between us, as if it had chosen me as the one who mattered. It did not charge me then, and it did not finish the fallen man, because it did not need to. It had already achieved what it came for. It backed away slowly, upright the entire time, never turning its body the way a normal predator retreats. It watched us as it withdrew into darkness, and the last thing I saw was the outline of its shoulders dissolving between the trees like smoke. When the forest swallowed it, the silence returned, and in that silence I understood something that made my mouth go dry. This was not a random attack. This was a lesson. It wanted us to know that it could touch us whenever it chose, and it wanted us to know that our courage did not matter to it. It only mattered that we understood who set the rules now. By the time the wounded man was carried back toward town, the story had already outrun us, because fear travels faster than facts, and because people fill silence with their own worst versions of the truth. The sheriff tried to hold the line, but you could see it in his face that he had reached the end of explanations that sounded reasonable even to himself. He had men bleeding, tracks he could not name, and now a witness statement from a logger who had nearly died saying the same word we had said, and the weight of that word sat over the town like weather that refused to move on. The injured hunter survived the night, but he did not survive in the way people mean when they use that word, because survival is not only about staying alive, and what the creature did to him left a different kind of damage behind. He woke in the doctor's office with his eyes wide and fixed, and he grabbed my sleeve with a grip that felt desperate, and he asked me in a hoarse whisper whether it had spoken again. When I told him that it had tried my name, he shook his head slowly, as if the answer confirmed something he had hoped was only his own imagination. He said that as the creature struck him, it had leaned close enough that he could feel the heat of its breath, and in that breath he had heard something that sounded like laughter, not joyful and not wild, but quiet and private, like someone enjoying a secret they intended to keep. That detail changed the shape of my fear, because an animal does not laugh, and a myth does not improvise, and only something that understands power enjoys demonstrating it that way. I went straight to the sheriff after hearing that, and I told him that the forest was no longer the center of the problem, because the creature was testing us and learning us, and every time we responded in predictable ways, we gave it more information. The sheriff listened, and for a moment I thought I saw him accept the truth, but then the familiar stubbornness returned to his jaw, and he said that if he used the word werewolf in an official report, the town would become a circus, and the county would send people who wanted headlines rather than answers. I told him that the town was already becoming a circus, because panic does not need permission, and it does not wait for paperwork. He asked me what I wanted him to do, and I said that I wanted him to tell the truth, because the truth at least gave people a chance to act with clarity, even if it frightened them. He looked at me with the tired contempt of a man who believes courage is easier in someone else's mouth, and he said he would increase patrols along the tree line, and he would advise people to stay indoors at night, and he would treat it like a dangerous animal until there was proof otherwise. Proof was the only word in that conversation that mattered, because proof is how people decide what is real, and proof is also how they decide what they can ignore. That afternoon, the sheriff received a call from the county office, and I could see the way his posture stiffened when he returned to his desk, because authority had finally noticed what was happening here, and authority never arrives with humility. The county representative arrived before evening, a man in a clean coat who smiled too easily and asked too many questions that were really statements in disguise. He wanted dates, names, locations, and he wanted to know whether any of the witnesses had a history of drinking, because it is always easier to discredit men than to confront an unknown. I sat in the corner while they spoke, because the sheriff allowed it only grudgingly, and I listened as our fear was translated into bureaucracy. The county man suggested hysteria, suggested a bear, suggested a pack of feral dogs, and suggested that hunters sometimes see what they want to see after a long night in the woods. I watched the sheriff nod along, not because he believed it, but because he needed something that sounded manageable. When the county man asked why there were no bodies, no clear kills, no feeding, I realized that he had finally stumbled into the heart of the problem without understanding it. Whatever we faced did not behave like a predator because it was not hunting for meat. It was hunting for control. That night, as I walked home under a moon that seemed too bright, I saw lanterns flickering in windows all across town, as if everyone had decided that light could keep fear outside. I stepped onto my porch and paused, because the air felt wrong again, heavy and still, and the silence carried the same alertness I had felt in the forest. Then I noticed something on the dirt near the bottom step, something that had not been there earlier, and my stomach tightened as I knelt to look. It was a print, deep and clean, pressed into the soil as if someone had placed it there carefully. The shape suggested a wolf's foot, but the heel had sunk as if weight had shifted forward, and beside it was another mark, longer, narrower, like the impression of a hand. The message was simple and unmistakable, and it did not need words to be understood. It had been here again, and it wanted me to know that it could cross any boundary I tried to draw. I did not sleep after finding that print, because sleep requires a belief in separation between night and safety, and that belief had been taken from me. I sat with the lamp on and listened for movement, and every small sound became a question with no answer, because the creature had changed the rules by refusing to behave like anything we knew. When morning came, I felt hollow rather than relieved, because daylight no longer meant protection, and the only thing it offered was visibility, which can be its own kind of cruelty. By midday, the sheriff had posted a notice advising people to stay indoors after sunset, and the words were carefully chosen to avoid saying why. The town read that notice as confirmation, because silence is louder than explanation, and within hours the streets emptied earlier than usual. Shopkeepers closed their doors before dark, children were kept inside, and men who would have laughed at any mention of the supernatural now spoke in careful half-sentences, as if naming the fear would invite it closer. I went back to the forest edge alone that afternoon, not because it was wise, but because I needed to know whether the creature had become interested in me specifically, or whether it was simply broadening its reach. I stayed on the road where the trees leaned in, and I walked slowly, watching the ground, listening for that familiar shift in the air that always came before silence fell. The world remained ordinary for several minutes, and then the birds stopped again, and the quiet arrived like a door closing. I froze and turned my head slightly, because I had learned that the creature noticed direct attention, and I did not want to show it that I had heard it. The sound came from within the brush, a single careful step, then another, and I could feel the distance between us tighten with each measured movement. I did not run, because running would have been the response it expected, and I did not call out, because calling out would have been an admission that I was afraid. I simply stood there and waited, and in that waiting I felt a calm settle over me that did not belong to courage but to resignation, because I understood that if it wanted me, the choice would not be mine. The creature emerged partially, staying behind a screen of branches that allowed it to remain deniable, and it did something that made my mouth go dry, because it lowered its head slightly as if acknowledging me. The gesture was small but unmistakable, and it carried the tone of a man tipping his hat before speaking. I realized in that moment that it had not only been watching us, but also studying the ways we communicate, the small signs of authority and respect that humans use to set hierarchy. It was learning our language without needing actual words. Then I heard it again, not a howl and not a voice, but a sound shaped like speech. And within that sound I recognized the broken syllable of my name, closer this time than before. The imitation had improved, which meant it had practiced, and the thought that it might have been practicing in the dark near my house made my skin prickle under my shirt. I took one step back, careful and slow, and the creature mirrored the movement, not closing the distance, but maintaining it, as if keeping a specific measurement mattered to it. That was when I understood what it was doing, because it was not chasing me, and it was not cornering me, and yet I felt controlled all the same. It was guiding me, shaping my movement by responding in ways that turned the road behind me into the only option. Each time I tried to angle away, it shifted subtly, and each time it shifted, I found myself returning to the center of the road as if I were being herded. A rancher uses a dog to guide cattle without touching them, and in that realization something cold moved through me, because I understood that I was not being attacked in the simple sense. I was being managed. I backed away until I reached the place where the road curved and the trees opened slightly, and there, in that wider patch of light, the creature stopped and held still, as if satisfied that it had proven its point. It did not need to kill me to win, because it had already demonstrated that my choices were not entirely my own. The creature remained upright, silent, watching, and then it did one final thing that felt like a signature. It raised one long arm and pressed its hand against the trunk of a tree, leaving a smear on the bark that looked dark even from where I stood. The gesture was slow and deliberate, like a man marking property, and I understood it as a claim, not only on that stretch of forest, but on the entire boundary between town and wilderness. When it finally withdrew, it did not retreat like an animal. It stepped back like a man ending a conversation on his own terms. I walked home with my jaw clenched tight enough to ache because the fear had transformed into something heavier, something like responsibility. The sheriff wanted proof, the county wanted explanations, the town wanted comfort, and the creature wanted control. Somewhere inside that collision, I realized what the next chapter of this story would require, and the thought made my hands go cold, because if it could guide me without touching me, then it could guide anyone, and the next time it decided to step out of the trees, it would not be to scare hunters. It would be to choose someone who could not fight back. I knew who it would choose before it happened, not because I could see the future, but because I finally understood the pattern. And patterns are the closest thing monsters have to a signature. It did not strike at random, and it did not strike for food, and it did not strike in the places where men expected danger, because expectation makes people alert, and alert people are harder to shape. It wanted the town to obey without understanding why, and the fastest way to create obedience is to hurt someone innocent enough that no one can justify it. That evening the air felt too clear, as if the cold had washed sound out of the world, and the moon rose sharp behind thin clouds that looked like torn cloth. I walked through town without telling anyone where I was going, because I had learned that fear spreads faster than strategy, and I could not afford to be stopped by well-meaning hands. I went straight to the small house near the edge of the road where the boy lived, the same boy who had come to the sheriff's office with shaking hands and a voice that kept catching on itself. His mother opened the door and looked at me with suspicion that softened into worry when she saw my face, and I told her to keep the boy inside, to lock every window, and to leave a lamp burning even if it cost her sleep. She asked me why, and I could not give her a clean answer, because clean answers do not exist for what was moving beyond the tree line. I told her there was something out there, something that watched, and that it had been coming closer, and then I saw the moment she decided whether to believe me. She did not believe in werewolves, and she did not need to, because her instincts recognized the truth in my urgency. She nodded once, tight-lipped, and she shut the door with a firm click that sounded like a prayer. I left and walked toward the road where the trees pressed close, because if the creature wanted to take someone from the edge of town, then it would use the darkness where it could remain unseen, while still being near enough to be felt. I carried my rifle, not because I believed it would end the creature, but because I believed it might buy seconds, and seconds are what decisions are made of. I carried a lantern too, because light is not only for seeing, but for being seen, and I wanted the creature to know I was not hiding. The silence came in waves, the same way it always did, and then the birds stopped, and the world narrowed to the sound of my own breathing. I stood on the road and waited, because running would have turned me into prey, and I was done giving it the comfort of predictable behavior. Minutes passed, then more minutes, and the cold deepened until my fingers felt stiff around the rifle stock. Then I heard it, that slow measured step in the brush, the confident placement of weight that told me it did not need to hurry. It emerged partially, tall and upright behind the trees, and even in the weak lantern glow I could see the outline of it. Broad-shouldered, long-armed, still as stone. I raised the rifle and held it steady, and I spoke in a voice that surprised me with how calm it sounded. I told it to leave the town alone, and I told it that if it wanted something it could take me instead. The words tasted bitter, because a part of me knew I was negotiating with a thing that did not respect negotiation, but another part of me believed that intelligence implies preference, and preference implies vulnerability. The creature took one step forward, and the lantern light caught its face enough for me to see the eyes, forward set and focused, reflecting a dull glint that felt like thought. It did not snarl. It did not howl. It simply watched me, and then it made that sound again, the one that shaped itself like speech, and this time it was not my name. This time it was the boy's name. My stomach dropped as if the earth had shifted, because that single imitation proved what I had dreaded since the moment it first tried to speak. It was not only listening, it was choosing. It was collecting names, and names are more than sounds, because names are how you pull a person's attention out of safety and into darkness. In that instant, I realized the creature did not need to break a door down or smash a window, because it could stand outside and call someone close enough that curiosity or fear would do the rest. I fired before I could think, and the shot tore through the trees, and the creature moved with that controlled speed that made it feel unreal. I saw the bullet strike its shoulder, and I saw hair and flesh burst, and for the first time, the creature made a sound that resembled pain. The sound was low and rough, not dramatic, but honest enough to make my heart jump, because it meant I had found something that could hurt it. It lunged then, and the distance disappeared, and I felt the air change as its mass entered my space. I swung the rifle up and fired again at point-blank range, and the impact drove the recoil into my shoulder like a hammer. The creature slammed into me anyway, not with the frantic rage of an animal, but with the force of something that understood exactly where my body would fail. I hit the ground hard, and the lantern rolled, throwing light across the road in wild, moving circles. For a second I saw it above me, upright, looming, and I expected teeth, expected claws, expected the final simple violence that would end the story. Instead, it did something worse, because it leaned down close, and I heard the breath, and within that breath I heard the shape of that quiet, private laughter again, as if it found the moment amusing. Then it lifted one long hand and pressed it against my chest, not hard enough to kill me, but hard enough to remind me how easily it could. It wanted me alive. It wanted me to remember. Then it stepped away, slow and deliberate, and I watched it retreat into the trees without ever dropping to four limbs. And that detail stayed with me because it felt like a choice, like a declaration of what it considered itself to be. When it vanished, the forest remained silent, and the lantern light steadied on the road, and I realized I was still breathing. I dragged myself upright and stumbled back toward town with my ribs aching and my hands shaking, because I understood the message as clearly as if it had been written in ink. It had allowed me to live because it did not want an ending. It wanted a witness. It wanted a story that would spread through fear and doubt and sleepless nights, because that is how it fed, not on flesh, but on the slow collapse of certainty. The sheriff did not want the word werewolf in his reports, and the county did not want the shame of admitting they could not control what lived in the woods, but none of that mattered anymore. The town already knew, and the town would change its behavior without official permission, which meant the creature had gotten what it wanted. It had turned a community into a cage built from its own fear. I left that county not long after, and I never hunted again, because hunting implies you are the one who chooses the terms, and I had learned what it felt like to be chosen instead. Even now, when the moon is bright and the night is quiet, I sometimes wake to the sense of measured breathing just beyond the edge of light. I tell myself it is memory. I tell myself it is the mind replaying what it cannot digest. But I also remember the print on my porch and the way it said without words that boundaries are only real when both sides respect them. If you are still here, then you already understand why I had to tell you this. Because stories like this are not entertainment when they are true enough to live inside you. Subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you think this happened and what you believe it was. Because there are places in this world that still go quiet the way that forest went quiet. And there are nights when the full moon does not feel natural. If you have ever heard a sound in the dark that seemed to imitate something human, then I want to know. Because the worst part of 1964 was not the attack itself. The worst part was realizing that something out there was listening, learning, and waiting for someone to answer when it finally called their name. If you made it this far, then you already know this was never just a story meant to be consumed and forgotten. Stories like this linger because they tap into something older than fear, something that recognizes the sound of footsteps in the dark and knows when they do not belong there. What happened in 1964 did not end when the forest went quiet, and it did not end when I walked away, because the kind of thing that learns does not disappear. It waits. If this story unsettled you, then it did its job, because horror is not about shock, it is about recognition. It is about that moment when you realize the world is slightly larger and stranger than you were told. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories pulled from the edges of history where reports stop making sense and witnesses stop being believed, then subscribe now, because every story shared here is chosen for one reason. It leaves a mark. Like this video if this story stayed with you longer than you expected, because that tells this channel that these are the stories worth uncovering. And most importantly, leave a comment telling me what story you want to hear next. A missing expedition, a sealed police file, a town that went silent, or another encounter like this one where something walked out of the dark and proved it was listening. Your comments decide which story gets told next, and some of the most disturbing stories ever shared begin as a single suggestion from someone who knows there is more hiding just beneath the surface. Until next time, pay attention to the quiet, because the quiet is where these stories begin.